Okay, welcome. This is going to be our flip lesson on what an IEP is, the Individualized Education Program for students with exceptionalities. There's been lots of talk about it. You might have some concerns, what it is your role as a general educator is with regards to this document, and just a lot of things. It's nothing to get overwhelmed about. We're just going to take it by section and so that you have a greater understanding of what this document can do and what it can't do, and also what your roles are. Okay, so what exactly is an IEP? According to special education law and the Children with Disabilities in Virginia, the IEP is this written statement for a child with a disability. And we had talked about that special education sometimes is unique instruction. So, whereas a child, sometimes without a disability, their guiding principles can be the SOLs or the classroom procedures. When a child it has been determined that a child has a disability, we then come together as a team and say, okay, what does this child need so that we're not in violation of that child's fate? What is it that's going to be necessary to meet the child's educational needs? And sometimes that is different from what a child without a disability has. Sometimes it's very similar. Who indeed is responsible for the IEP? Well, all of us are. When we look at that particular student, we as a country have said, look, these children, disabled or not, have value, and we can make a great deal of difference if we work together as a collaborative team. And that key component here is that team component, that we come together and work with that particular student to identify those unique needs that they have, and sometimes work around, sometimes we're going to remediate, but that we get everyone at the table that has a vested interest in this child. And sometimes that is going to be the student, that they get together and they give us feedback. Clearly, the regular education teacher is going to be there so that they can give performance indicators. They can say, these are the things that I'm seeing in the class. These are the things that we can do. Here's some things that I might need to fully include the child. There needs to be a school system representative, someone that can make fiscal decisions. A lot of times that's going to be a principal. If transition services, and transition sometimes is identified as transitioning to the workforce, but sometimes transition can also be transitioning to the general ed classroom. Other times it can be transitioning from middle school to high school. But most of the time when we talking about transition, we're talking about transitioning from from school to work. And that's not something that just happens their senior year. State law used to be by age 14 we had to have a transition plan in place, but now 16 is when they mandate that a transition plan comes in place. But there's lots of people like Berliner who say, hey, look, these things have to occur very early on. So there's going to be, obviously, if needed, and the child's a little bit older, some transition services. Clearly, the parents are going to be involved in this process. They're a wealth of information. Sometimes they're very knowledgeable. Sometimes they might be a little intimidated. Sometimes they might not understand exactly what's going on. Sometimes they have a lot of fears. Sometimes they are very in tune to what their child's rights are. I wish I could categorize it and say this is what a typical SPED parent is, but I can't. Parents that have children with disabilities are as different as children with disabilities or children in general. But they are valuable and should be at the table, and their input should be utilized. We can also look at others. This is a hodgepodge, but anyone that has an understanding or an interest in that child can be invited to the table that could give us some insight. And then we also have the evaluator, the assessor, who has run a variety of assessments on the child and can interpret those assessments. And then, of course, the special educators will be there who can interpret the laws and guide us and help with the services that the child needs. Continuing with what the IEP team should consider, child strengths. It's imperative that we focus on what the child can do. It's really tempting to say, well, the child can't do this, and the child can't do this, and the child can't do that. We need to focus on what the child can do, and it's not we don't do that because it makes us feel better or it seems better. There's a real reason for that. It's very difficult and very challenging for me to figure out the instructional level of a child. It's very difficult for you to figure out the instructional level of the child if all we have is this list of things they can't do. There's 1,000 things I can't do. There's 1,000 things you can't do. That doesn't generally point me in the direction of where I need to start. But if I know what the child can do, then that's their independent level. And I, as a curriculum expert, and you, as a curriculum expert, can see the next logical step in their instruction. So when we focus on what the child can do, it really helps us a great deal to figure out, okay, this is going to be their instructional level, as opposed to this litany of things, of items that says what the child can't do, and that generally doesn't help us very much. One thing we don't do sometimes is listen to parent concerns. We sometimes are polite and we say, sure, no problem. But a lot of times we don't push, or we don't ask follow-up questions, or we don't ask clarification statements. The parents are a wealth of knowledge, and sometimes they're very good at communicating. Sometimes they're not. We need to work with a whole litany of personality types, because I wish I could say, look, here's the typical SPED parent, but I can't. No more so than I can say, here's a typical child with a disability. No more so than I can say, here's a typical 13-year-old. They share some commonalities, but again, it is individual, and you're going to have to get a feel and a working relationship. But the parent concerns is a great place to start. Let them talk. Let them sit and say, these are the things that I want from my child. And a lot of times they're very spot on. And we can get the parents to work with us. It's always, always much better. So we want to make sure that we are listening to their concerns for enhancing their child's education. We also need to take a look at these results of that initial evaluation. What did the standardized assessments point to? We've talked a lot about assessments in the class. There's a lot of things assessments can do and can't do. With these standardized assessments, it is a point in time. It could be spot on. It might not be. But we don't want to get into that debate, because we do run a variety of assessments, especially in eligibility, to validate what this child can do and where their strengths are and their areas of growth. And so when the assessment person, it could be a special educator, it could be a counselor, starts talking about IQ and starts talking about standard scores, it's important that you don't get nervous about that, but that you understand that these assessments tell us or point us in the direction of the specific areas where the disability could be impacting the child's academic achievement. And that's great information. It's not anything to scoff at. It's not anything to always question. It's, okay, is it validating what you're seeing in the class? And if it is, then that helps us with determining what a child can do. And again, these assessments will not only point out academic gaps that might not be there if not for the disability, but it also is a great instructional tool to say, okay, this is where we can start with this particular child. So with that in mind, drink that in. And if something is confusing, it's real important to say, hey, well, I don't really quite understand 100 score. Is that average? These things are critically important, is that you understand what assessment they're talking about and what it's measuring. Is it measuring achievement, like a Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement and cognitive abilities, or is it more along the lines of, a WISC, which is really measuring the IQ of a child or their potential? So, because those are very different assessments, being able to understand what they can and can't do and what they're trying to measure is going to be really important to you when you're formulating goals, especially academic goals for this child. So we also want to take a look at the academic development, the functional needs, and the functional needs of the child. Sometimes there's some mobility issues. Sometimes there's some communication issues. These things are going to have to be addressed, and they're going to have to be addressed in detail, so that the child is going to, so that we're not violating the FAPE of that particular child. All right. Still, what we should be considering with the IEP, and a critical component here, because we talked a great deal already about their academic and their development and their developmental and their functional needs as a result of their disability or in conjunction with their disability. We haven't spoken too much about the IEP time is where we're sitting and saying, how much are they going to be involved in the general curriculum? Our general curriculum in the state of Virginia is the SOL curriculum. Most children will use that. There are other curriculums dependent on cognitive ability that we find is appropriate for a particular child. So how much is this child going to be involved in the general curriculum? Are they going to take SOL assessments? Are they going to be exposed to the SOL curriculum? Are they going to be expected to master that curriculum? These are all things that are on the table that we discussed during that meeting. We're going to meet each other's educational needs that result in the child's disability. So each child's academic needs are going to be addressed. Most of the kids with IEPs, they are in the general ed curriculum. They are expected to take the SOL assessments. And we're just going to come up with a plan that's going to take the edge off, that's going to help address the disability, that's going to provide some accommodations, that's going to address some strategies, that's going to work with them on any skill deficits that they might have as a result of their disability, and then also to be able to figure out, all right, how can I might process a bit differently, but what is it that I need that's going to allow me to be able to compete in that general ed classroom? And most children with IEPs do that, and do that very, very well. Okay, so now we're looking at this wall of text, which, again, can become very overwhelming, and it really shouldn't. But because we deal with so many nuances, and obviously not every child with a IEP is going to necessarily need all of these services, but all these services are available in case a child is indeed in need of that. If a child is blind or visually impaired, we're going to have some real specific services for them. If they have limited English proficiency, we're going to have some real specific services for them. Not that limited English proficiency is a disability, but sometimes children come in who are disabled, who have where English might not be their first language. We're going to be able to deal with that. Some children come in and they have some behavior issues. And while a behavior disorder is a diagnosis, just because children have behavior problems doesn't necessarily make them disabled. But nonetheless, if a child does have some behavior issues, then what are some of the things that we can do to address that? There's also things there for children that are deaf or of hard of hearing. Clearly, not everybody's going to need all of these special factors or have to deal with some of the communication needs that are unique for a child that's deaf or hard of hearing, or a child that's blind or visually impaired. There's a lot of things that we can provide, but not necessarily for every child. Let's talk a little bit about the goals. We talked a great deal about goals. We talked about that most of the children who have an IEP are, so we know these guys, a lot of them, if not most of them, are going to be expected to be able to accomplish and master the content aligned with the SOLs. Okay, great. Back in the day, and we still see lots of IEPs like this, they had real specific goals that were more aligned with what the special educator felt was appropriate for them. Sometimes they were academic goals, and sometimes they were behavior goals. Sometimes it was a combination of both. But we see more and more this notion of standards-based IEPs. Standards are going to be our SOL standards, so the IEP is going to be based upon accomplishment of those standards. It's directly linked to and framed by Virginia's SOLs. So we're going to see not a cut and paste job, but we're going to see the goals and assessments, progress monitoring. They are going to be very much in line with SOLs. That's good news for you because that's something you feel very comfortable with. SOL instruction is what you have learned about, how you can meet these standards, and we want children with exceptionalities to be able to master the exact same content. So, with that being said, we want to align the IEP so that it is indeed matched with the standards that they are going to be assessed on. Is there a difference between what the end product's going to be? Sometime back in the 80s and 90s, we had certain diplomas, certificates of attendance, and things like this that a lot of the children with exceptionalities have. And sometimes their diploma is going to be somewhat different. But for those children who are going to be, their goals are aligned with SOLs, their instruction and the expectations are exactly the same to be able to pass these SOLs, there should not be a big difference between what the end product is with regards to a diploma. So, is there a difference between traditional IEP and standard-based IEP? Traditionally, IEPs have focused on the students acquiring these kind of academic skills, having access to certain things, and a lot of times there wasn't a big connection between the grade level instruction and what was going on sometimes in the SPED classroom. And what we said is, if we're expecting these kids to go and to assimilate into the general education classroom because that's their least restrictive environment, we've got to tighten this up and make sure that our IEP objectives are aligned with the state standards. This exact same thing that children without disabilities are expected to do. So we've seen some shift there until instead of having these random kind of academic goals, we're going to get them to a third grade reading level or something along those lines. They are going to be very linked to those specific SOL items, both the student's present level of performance, how they're doing, and their annual goals, what we expect them to do in a year. Those are going to be aligned with 4.2s, fourth grade second standard. They're going to be very clearly linked. Now, there are going to be some kids who the SOL content is not their curriculum. They have a much more functional curriculum. We won't see a standards-based IEP with these individuals. They have a very unique curriculum that is challenging for them, but it is designed to allow them to function independently. But as we've said time and time again, the overwhelming number of students with an IEP have a disability, have a learning disability, and those individuals are at least average intelligent. And so we expect those individuals to be able to not only be exposed to the SOL-driven standards-based content, but to master that content just as any other student. So the standards-based IEP have acted as a bridge between the special education classroom and the general education classroom. No longer are these goals going to be diametrically opposed, but they are going to be in tandem, and we, special education and general education, are going to work together to be able to accomplish those goals. Well, that all sounds great, but how do we get there? I mean, we have to have unique instruction because of the disability, but yet, Jones, what you're saying is they have the same expectations as a child maybe that doesn't have a disability. Should we have those same expectations? In most cases, absolutely yes. When we start lowering the expectations on students, then they live up to those expectations. And if a student has a mild learning disability, there's no reason why they can't, with a few accommodations and a few modifications, can't excel in your classroom. And there's a lot of time and planning that has been spent on coming up with a IEP that does indeed address those accommodations or those unique aspects. There might be some remediation that needs to occur in maybe in your general ed classroom or in an alternative setting, but nonetheless, these things are all developed in the IEP, and they might be modified and refined over the course of the year. They generally are, but basically, we're just going to say, what does this kid need to excel? Not just get by, but to excel in that SOL, standard-based curriculum. And when we see that, and it has to be aligned with their current grade level. So yeah, they might be reading significantly lower, but we've got to get them to that fourth grade content. Now we might have to teach them first grade basic reading to get there. And I think that's fine, but that's part of some contention. Should we teach them first grade content, or should we teach them fourth grade because they're going to be assessed fourth grade? Well, you see that with non-disabled kids who are just lagging behind. Well, we're going to teach them at their instructional level. We're not going to violate that assumption. But we've got to accelerate these kids. We can't, if we've got a kid that's a couple grade levels behind, we can't be satisfied. Well, they made a grade level progress. We can't be satisfied with that. We've got to get 1.5 grade levels, 2 grade levels, so that they can get accelerated and get caught up to their peers. So we have to address that disability. You're going to work in conjunction with the special educator who's going to help you with some strategies and some techniques. They themselves are going to come into the classroom and work with you. And then we push this kid. We accelerate them. And in conjunction as a partner, we see some real good things happening. Okay, up to this point, we've kind of talked about the philosophy behind an IEP and how we really want to, set high expectations, clear expectations. We want to make sure that we are aligning the curriculum with the standards as much as possible. Of course, I ran out of room there. So as much as possible, we want to make sure that we're aligning that curriculum with standards. So, okay, we got it. We're going to have high expectations. We're going to link most of children with disabilities instruction with the general education standards. Got it. Okay. I realize there's probably going to be some accommodations. There's probably going to be some additional instruction that is necessary. There might be some enhancements. There might be some technology or some kind of communication devices or some other things that might come into play. And I'm not quite sure how they all work, but I know I've got a good partnership with the SPED folks, and so they're going to kind of help me. And so I get all this. So what does it have to contain? Virginia requires that there's a plop statement, and that plop statement is called the present level of academic achievement. It is that present level of performance is generally what we call it. It is, what can this kid do right now? And again, that goes back to that strength based, that we say, look, we got to have strength based. We're not going to sit there and give me a list of things the kid can't do. I mean, you don't want a list of things you can't do. No one does. It's kind of depressing. But what we do want is, here's what the child can do. And they might not be able to do this. Wait, did I just violate it? I just said something that the kid can't do. No, no, no. What we're trying to do is find that instructional level. This is what the kid can do. But you bump it up a little bit, and that's when they start falling apart. Great, okay, that's my instructional level. That's that kid's present level of a performance. We also, in the IEP, have a list of accommodations and modifications and any sort of services, related services, speech, language, transportation, anything that that child needs, so that we're not violating their FAPE and we're accelerating them. Guess what? It's right there in the IEP. The student's level of non-participation with peers in the general education setting. If that child's not going to be in the general ed classroom, we need to identify why. And we need to be able to document it. It can't just be based upon your opinion. That we have to document that and show that if we're going to remove this child, there's a real reason for that. Either it's not their LRE, or we've got to be able to do something that we can't do in the general ed classroom. It can't just be because it's convenient, or we just, the teacher's, not a very receptive to. That's violation of the child's faith. So if that child is not going to participate, we've got to have some sort of justification. And also there needs to be a plan in place. So, we're going to get them back in, or we just removing them for 6 months? Or are we going to get her back in, in 3 months or 3 years? What is our plan? So, and there has to be that justification. We need to talk about state assessments and how they plan to take it. State of Virginia has no opt-out. There is no alternative portfolio anymore. There is no VGLA. Our students have some accommodations that they can have. There's a whole list of check boxes to have those accommodations, and we have to document that. In essence, our kids are expected to take the exact assessments as is. We need to figure out how that's going to occur. Some kids may take a alternative assessment, but that's really only going to be 2% of your population, and that's really only based upon those kids with significant intellectual capacity problems. Their IQ is low, and it can only be 2% of your division. And so that no longer, in the early 2000s, we had these kids opting out of tests. We had them in the VGLA portfolio assessments. But now they're taking the assessments, and they're part of your class. What are some methods of assessing and reporting student progress? We talked a little bit about in class, and we'll talk a great deal more about about response to intervention and how we can use this formative assessment to document progress on those goals. So if we have standard-based goals, then we've got to be able to measure that progress. Now that's the good news is that's just not a SPED thing. That's probably what you're going to want to do with all of your kids. You want to show and document, are they responding to your intervention, your instruction? That's just good teaching. We put in best practices that you're learning. Great. Then we've got to make sure that what we're doing is actually working. We do have Nickleby. Nickleby says, look, we're not going to leave any child behind. And we got to make sure that that student is progressing, and we have to show it quantitatively a lot of times. So that good formative assessment that you're thinking about in your TWS, that's good data, and that's good process, and we do that with assessing students with IEPs. We need to look at 14 students who have transition issues. It must be in place at 16. We need to start taking a look at it at 14. I'd encourage you to look at it much younger, that there's all these transition issues like getting up at time, being responsible, personal hygiene, how listening to instruction, social skills, working in groups, things that I think a lot of us would benefit from. But sometimes children with exceptionalities, they lack sometimes some of them some skills, some social skills. So being able to, what does this child need to be able to keep a job, to stay in college, to do what their aspirations are, to be able, what skills do they need to have so that they can live that life that they are planning. So the plop is just basically, again, that student's present level of performance. So we're going to talk about the student's academic achievement, their current functioning performance, and how the disability affects the student's involvement or progress in participating in the general curriculum. So in that first part, that's where a lot of those standardized assessments come into place, a key math, a Woodcock-Johnson, a Woodcock reading. This is where a lot of those assessments you don't have to run, but are run by either the special educator or the school counselor, but they bring to the table. Your information is also vitally important if you've been working with that child, because you're doing great formative assessment. You're doing running records. You are collecting performance data on the child. That information is going to be really important in formulating that plop. A lot of times the plop is pre-written, but I always say, Barbara Bateman would say, look, the best IEP in an IEP meeting is a blank piece of paper. Reality, yeah, probably, and we just sit down and we write this, but that's just not going to happen because it's not a very efficient way, and I'm not so sure that's the best way to do it. But I always say, yeah, have something written, have goals, have the plot statement, but write it in pencil. It's not inked yet. It's not official yet. So it's just, here's what we're seeing, and then it's open to discussion. So that's what the plop statement is. It's usually at the very beginning, after the kind of the indicate demographic kind of stuff, at the beginning of the IEP. The first meat of the IEP is, this is what the kid can do. It's usually a page or so, sometimes a little bit longer. So if we look, and you can take some time or blow this up a little bit, I was just going to take some sections of it, but it just didn't make sense. But this is a great indicator, and take some time to kind of read this, because this is indeed Jane's plop. It's what Jane is, a fourth grader student who is included in the general ed classroom with accommodations and support. So a review of the assessment standards of learning and input from parents. So this is basically how these plops are written, but I wanted to include this. Clearly not going to go over a lot of this. We'll talk about it a little bit more in class, but I wanted you to have an example of Jane's present level of performance, so that you're used to seeing these components and being able to extrapolate the information, so that you can better say, okay, this is where the child's instructional level is, because that's what everything's about right now. And coming up with a standard-based objectives, we need to know where the kid is. Because if we're in a fourth grade classroom and she's right now performing on a first grade level in reading, we got to figure out how to get her there. We just can't teach her fourth grade content and hope that some of it sinks in. We've got to figure out and come up with a plan that either accelerates her or accommodates her while we're remediating her. So and that has to be a pretty tight plan, else it's going to kind of fall apart. So this standards, this plop helps us a great deal with our standards. Annual goals. We're looking at annual goals. The IEP goals set what are we reasonably expecting a child to accomplish in one academic year. And sometimes they're very broad stroked in nature. We're going to increase this reading level. We're going to do this. We used to have a lot, and I still like, and I still include a lot of short-term objectives in this, but our annual goals are in a standards-based IEP are going to be linked to the standards, the child's grade level standards, and their progression toward that. If they are not using a standards-based IEP objective and they're using more traditional, then those goals are going to be not as aligned, but they're still going to be academic focused for the most part. We still will see some behavior goals depending on the child's disability, but we always are going to see a academic focus to these goals. So there is a format, because there's always a format, on how to develop these goals. And these goals have to be measurable. They can't be abstract. We're going to raise Jane's self-esteem. I have a very hard time measuring that. We're going to increase her creativity. I have a hard time measuring that. We need goals that are measurable, that she's going to go from a 1.4 grade level to a 2.8 to a 3.1, something that is very measurable. That are aligned again with the content standards. And there's some questions that we can kind of ask ourselves. What are the students' needs as identified in the PLOP? That PLOP is from not only those standardized assessments, but from parent interview, from you, the general education teacher. It's imperative that we get good, clean data from you and where you see this. So what that student needs is going to be based on where they are academically, if that's making sense. If we need to get this kid to a 4th grade level in whatever, and this child is significant, what do they need? What skills do the students require to master their grade level standard-driven content, and what can they reasonably expect to accomplish in 1 year? So to sit there and say, okay, this kid's at a pre-primal level, and we're going to get him to a 8th grade reading level in 1 year, that's not reasonable. That may be desirable and optimistic, but that's not reasonable. And sometimes schools do this with regular kids who are at a deficit. They say they're in 8th grade, they have to get 8th grade content. Well, if they're reading at a 3rd grade level, is that reasonable? Because I don't know many teachers who feel that they can raise that reading level, and also lots of 8th grade teachers don't have a whole lot of training in emergent literacy. So what's reasonable, and what does that teacher need? And in that particular case, that teacher is going to have a reading specialist who comes in and helps. That's going to be part of that IEP. So those annual goals are really going to start driving what that child needs. If we expect that child to make 3 years progress and they're in an 8th grade setting, or they're in a 5th grade setting and we expect 2 years, 3 years progress, this might not be beyond the capacity of the general educator, who is still responsible for delivering standard-based instruction to 22 other kids that are in his or her classroom. They may need some assistance. Okay, not a problem with that. In fact, they probably will need some assistance. So what assistance do you need? And that's where your voice comes in. Hey, I really need to have this reading specialist. If we're going to do this, we need to pull this child out 3 times, 4 times a week, not from the language arts class that I'm teaching, but, from some resource class, which I know is difficult. But if we were going to address this, then they're going to have some extra time with the reading specialist. And guess what? The reading specialist and I need to plan at least weekly, so that we're communicating. So all of these things have to come in place as we're developing those annual goals. Once we're sitting in that meeting, we're coming up with these goals and we're reading them off, that's when you're like, hold on, because a lot of times they're already written, and you're sitting back and you're like, wait a minute, how am I going to do this? Am I going to get some? And that's where that dialogue can occur, and it should occur. It's not always nice and neat and polite, but it is through that exchange that a really good plan can be developed. So, step one, print the appropriate PDF from the skill worksheet that I will include and will be on Canvas. It's at www.doevirginia.gov. And then you just gather and analyze the data, okay, and how the student has performed in each of the strands within this form. And this is a really great form. And I'm going to briefly go over this, but this is something that we're going to do in class where we're going to go over this particular form. So based on the plop statement, what is necessary for that particular child? What do they need to have? What is critical in being able to meet those standards? And after we've complete that worksheet, based on that data that we've collected and the knowledge that we have of this student and what we've gained from the plop, then that's when we can go in and address those specific skills. And any additional space is there under the strand for comments or notes. And so we're going to sit here and we're going to take it a step at a time. And I love these kind of worksheets, and the DOE has done, Virginia DOE has done a pretty good job of stepping that out. Okay, so let's take a look at this worksheet that I was just referring to. And this is going to be kind of based on a standard base. Again, the standards are the Virginia SOL. So in step one, we could go back and forth, is we review the SOL strand for that particular student. So we're looking at numbers and number sense, and that's SOL 5.1, 5.2A through B, and 5.3AB. And we're going to list those standards and those strands will be listed right there in that particular box for the particular objective. And okay, and then if you see the next box here, we see to the right, what data are we going to assess whether that child has mastered 5.1, 5.2 AB? Well, we're going to look at their plop, we're going to look at standardized test data, we're going to look at classroom assessments, we're going to look at teacher observations. How did we know that's where they should be? That is their instructional level. And then once we get that and we say, okay, this is how we reviewed this data and this is how we see it, then we write it up in that objective. And we'll go over in class, that given this condition, Jane will, and then we give the mastery criteria. Get 7 out of 9 correct over 3 trials on this particular number sense sequence. It's going to be a very specific, by January 5th, it's going to be a very specific, here's what they're going to do, and here's when they're going to have it done by. Now, once we get those goals, and it's really important to have those specific goals. I see a lot of IEPs where they're very vague at this point. We'll develop more confidence in number sense. They're going to we're going to be very specific with regards to how they're going to accomplish this. Because if it's vague, you have no idea what services you need or what support you need. If you know that you've got to take this child from here to here, then you're going to need some assistance, especially if the content that we're talking about is markedly different than what you're teaching. And if the time allocation for that particular child is going to be much more, then you're going to need some sort of assistance, and that's fine. I mean, that's what special ed is for. I mean, we're there to assist, to help, to co-teach, to pre-teach, to do a variety of things that assist you in your delivery of standard-based content instruction. And that's fine. We're a team. We're not adversarial at all. We don't want to be. We shouldn't be. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't occur and that there aren't bad partnerships, but usually it's because we're not on the same page as far as the goals. But if we put these goals down in very quantitative terms, and everybody knows what we're trying to do, and we're clear on the services and the accommodation and the extra supports that are needed, and we all agree to that, it's much more likely that we're going to have a very collegial partnership. If I'm just throwing something at you and they're not providing any support, guess what? It's much more likely that we're going to have some conflict because you're going to be overwhelmed and I'm not really doing my job. And if you're coming in and you have some perceptions that every child in your class is going to have to get the exact same instruction and they're just going to have to deal with it, then that's kind of a violation of that child's faith. And so that's not really working well together. So I think I know at the planning stage, if we're collaborating and everybody's on the same page, yes, there's going to be some hiccups, but we're much more likely to be a team. And then, of course, down here at the bottom is any notes, and then the data analysis. And that's, I don't want to make that an afterthought, but we're just going to spend a lot of time on assessment and RTI. And you've already spent a great deal of time on that. So I don't want to minimize it, but we set these goals and they are meaningless unless we have data that supports that student is responding to that intervention. And if they are indeed responding to that intervention, then we are feeling pretty good. If they're not responding to that intervention, then we have to reconvene and we have to figure out, okay, what are we going to do different? Because obviously our best guess didn't work. Is there some enhancements or there's some alterations that we can make? Let's sit down and let's discuss it and let's figure out what we can do to get this kid back on track. So let's take a look at the completed goal, the annual goal that Jane, remember we're taking a bunch of information. We're taking the plop statement, which is the present level of performance. We are taking student grades, student work, parent information, your information, standardized assessments. We're doing a variety of things and we've developed a plop statement. And from that plop statement and all this other data, we are now, based on the standards of the state, we are coming up with an academic goal. By the end of the current school term, so that gives us a time frame, using grade level reading materials and graphic organizers. Now, these are probably things that are being used in your classroom right now. They might not be. If they're not, these are things that we're going to work with you to include in your class, not just for the child with exceptionality, but all your children. Using grade level reading materials and graphic organizers. Then who, Jane, and what are we expecting her to do? Will draw conclusions, summarize content, make inferences, and locate evidence from text to support generalizations with 80% accuracy, 3 out of 4 collected work samples. So let's breaking that down is right here. This is the time frame by the end of the academic school year. And what are some of the things that she's going to use? Using grade level. So this wouldn't be a realistic goal if Jane is reading at a first grade level, a pre-primer level. But she's reading a little bit behind, and so we're going to have lots of benchmarks, short-term objectives that are going to help us get to that point. But at the end of the year, this is an annual goal. We want her using grade level reading materials and graphic organizers. Jane then is going to be able to do these very standard base, you will probably recognize these as 4th grade reading language arts standards, drawing conclusions, summarizing content, being able to make inferences, locate evidence in the text to support generalizations or those wonderful inferential questions. Okay, and she's going to do that with 80% accuracy. We're not looking at 100% accuracy, and it's not going to be a one-shot deal. She's going to do that 3 out of 4 times. It's a great goal. It's a great annual objective that puts everybody, this is what we have to do. Now, there's going to be some lots of subcomponents to say, okay, we're going to do lesson plans on drawing conclusions, or maybe I'm going to have to pull out because it's not really the curriculum that you're teaching, so I'm going to teach a mini lesson on summarizing content or just kind of reinforcing some of that. You and I are going to collaborate and say, okay, she's really almost there with drawing conclusions, but boy, she's having a really hard time with summarizing content. So those are those interventions that I'm going to be able to use that's going to be able to help her with that. Okay? All right, we've talked a lot about reading, but let's take a little bit of a look at math in the standard 4.2, where the student is going to compare and order fractions and mixed numbers and represent. This is just taken straight from the Virginia standards. Nothing you haven't seen before. Maybe not this particular standard, but you know what Virginia SOLs are. And from those standards that we just took a look at, we can now write these objectives. Using manipulatives, models, and drawings, Jane will be able to compare, order, and represent fractions having denominators of 12 or less with 80% accuracy at the end of the third 9 weeks. So again, these are the materials that she's using manipulatives, models, and drawings. That's what we've been teaching her in the class. Who, Jane, what is she going to be able to do? We'll be able to compare and order and represent fractions having denominators of what? 12 or less. And what's the mastery criteria? 80% accuracy by the end of the third weeks. Now, the only thing I probably would have put in here 3 out of 4 times so that we're not looking at a one-shot deal. Okay, so that in a nutshell is an IEP. It goes from after identification, we suspect a disability. We have now validated a disability through the assessments and the reporting. Okay, so fine. She's eligible. He's eligible. We're going to develop a plot statement that is based upon the students' standardized assessments, the reports from parents, the students' feedback, the quality of work, and the assessments, the informal assessments that the general educator has collected. Based upon that, we can determine that child's present level of performance. What can they do? And kind of highlight, and this they can't, and it's really close to this. And so we're pinpointing what the child can do. Now, based upon that, we align where they are now and where the standard says they should be. And we say, ooh, pretty close. Let's just put some slight alterations. Let's give them some additional time on a test, or maybe go in a quiet place. Little simple accommodations. Or, oh boy, we got a big gap. All right, how are we going to accelerate her? How are we going to get that? So we're going to do some remediation. We're going to give her some additional time with a reading specialist. That reading specialist will not just going to pull out and never communicate with the general educator. We're going to make sure that they are tight, that they're communicating, and we're going to measure the progress using AIMSweb or whatever, easy, RTI, some sort of assessment. We're going to use a QRI 5. I don't know, whatever it is that we decide. Okay, we're going to measure that progress. And we formulate that goal into something that is reasonable, realistic. We're not going to take a child from a pre-K to an 8th grade level in 1 year. I mean, the principal can yell all they want to, that they've got to take 8th grade standards. It's just not going to happen. It's just, in most cases, it's really just not going to happen. So what is realistic that we can do? We want to get that kid to an 8th grade level, not a problem, but it's going to take us 3 years to do that. Okay? And here's our plan. So that whole multitude of good, solid data is then brought down into some sort of objective that says, okay, here's the precursors. Who is this individual? What are they going to do? What's that mastery criteria? And now let's start picking away at that. Okay. In a nutshell, that's an IEP. There's lots of other little forms that go with it, parent sign off, and we'll definitely take a look at those. And a Virginia Department of Ed template IEP so that you can become real familiar with it. It looks pretty official. But what we talked about here, the plop and the accommodation lists and the goal setting, that's the meat of it. That's the program in the individualized education program. And I hope that was clear. If not, it's always here for you to go back and review it again. Thanks for paying attention. There is quiz questions now after this that are open up and you can take on Top Hat.